Welcome. Another episode in the Fixing Education series. And today the question is simple. Is the university worth it for a student who is interested in a degree to study the humanities? So when we say, is it worth it? Think about it this way. You have a cousin or a nephew or a son and ask you a sincere question. A, I like the arts, I like literature, I like politics. So with humanities, we include social sciences. And I have a passion for this field or for history or something like that. Is it worth it for me to go to the university? And we will examine this question with my colleague in the Ayn Rand Institute, Dr. Ben Bayer, who, like myself, he has migrated from traditional academia to a full-time job at the Ayn Rand Institute. And also we are teaching at the Ayn Rand University. But we will discuss mostly about conventional academia. So Ben, simple question. Are the humanities worth it to study at the university?
Simple question, and my very simple answer will be, it depends. It depends on a lot of
Just for the record, my answer will be no. 98% of the cases no. So people, you have on the table what's our take on the topic. So our cards are open. So Ben, it depends on what?
Well, a lot of things. It depends. The classic parents' question is, or you go to a family meeting or whatever, and you tell them you're majoring in philosophy, and they say, "What are you going to do with that?" And it depends on what you're going to do with that, I think. It also depends on what kind of study you're talking about. So, are you talking about going to graduate school to get a PhD? Are you talking about a master's degree? Are you talking about a bachelor's degree? Are you talking about philosophy versus some other field in the humanities? Are you talking about just taking some classes as opposed to majoring in some field in the humanities? And
okay, so
that's a decreasing scale of commitments. And the bigger the commitment that you make, the more you're obviously going to need to be able to justify what you're going to do with that.
You see, I have a slightly different view. My view, in short, is it's worth it only if you have a clear view at the end of the road, which is something like I want to teach at the university or I want to be a teacher. So because to do this, the only available path is through an undergraduate degree and then a master and a PhD. If this is the goal of your life, then clearly university is the path. Or if it's a profession that you have to have a degree, for example, in most countries, being a teacher requires a university degree, then I would say do it. But then the question is not, is it worth it? Then the question is, there is no question because that's the only way to do it. So let me simplify a bit the question. If someone has a passion, let's say for literature, is the proper way to pursue this passion, and they're not yet sure what they want to do. They might want to be a teacher, they might want to be something else. Is the proper path in order to pursue this passion, is it through the university? We're talking here about an undergraduate degree, so let's start from the simple stuff. And also to put some perspective in this discussion, in the UK, this would cost you something like 9,000 per year. Of course, the government pays it and then you repay through taxes. But in the in the US, it would cost you anywhere from 15,000 per year. Let's say if you go in a California university and you live in California, or it could go up to even 60-something thousand a year. So make this times 4, and you see what type of investment we're talking about. So Ben, I have a passion for literature. Shall I study literature at the university?
Well, I don't think that's enough to justify it, especially if it costs as much as it can for some people. Now, if you go to a state school that's in-state, you get in-state tuition, you can save a lot of money. There's other ways to save money besides that. But let's bracket the money question for a moment and assume either because you found a good deal or because your family is independently wealthy, that you can afford to do it. And of course, unfortunately, you can't always bracket that in real life, but let's just for the sake of the question, assume you can. Then I think, it's still the case that you've got to be able to justify to yourself and to your parents who are helping to pay for it, what you're going to do with that. And so unlike you, I think I do think there are justifications that work. As you say, I mean, the best reason to get a degree in a field in the humanities is if you want to do it professionally, especially as if you want to do it as a professional academic. Now, options for doing that are increasingly rare. So we could have a whole separate conversation, maybe we should still, about like how realistic is it to expect that you could actually get one of these jobs. It's decreasingly realistic that you could, but like there are still, I think, benefits and values to be had in, if not majoring in a field in the humanities, then at least studying it significantly in an undergraduate career. It's just true that a lot of jobs require a bachelor's degree of some kind. Now, it's a good question, like, should they require it, or is this just some inflated credentialism? But it's still true that they do. And so if to get a job of any kind someday you need to have a degree, well, you might as well get one that educates you, that gives you a broader view of the world. And I think studying the humanities in university can do that. There are actually also a lot of professional careers that you can pursue where, I mean, apart from just the general broadening of your horizons, studying some kind of field like philosophy is actually going to give you a competitive advantage. And here's my list of fields where I know people who majored in philosophy. They didn't do graduate school in philosophy. Sometimes they did, actually, but where they at least majored in philosophy and where that was a big help for what they went on to do professionally. Law, psychology, computer science, education, increasingly, I think, even business. It would even be nice if more politicians studied philosophy. I fear that's not often going to be the case, but because if you studied humanities, you'd probably decide, why would I want to be a politician? But gee, it would be nice if they did. All of those are fields where having general background knowledge in the humanities and also in knowledge of proper thinking skills is incredibly important to have. And I've known a lot of people who've gone on to pursue very profitable, successful careers in those fields with, armed with something like a philosophy degree. And that's just the kind of narrower instrumental value that you get from studying these fields in terms of what profession it gets you. But I could also give a list of reasons why I think there are benefits to studying the humanities in a university setting, broader than professional ones. Like even if, let's say, you are an objectivist, let's say you think objectivist philosophy is the right one, you've studied a lot of philosophy on your own, you've studied objectivist philosophy on your own, well, there's still a real advantage to being able to study thinkers that you disagree with to get a better idea of how their philosophies compare and contrast with yours. Especially if you're a young person, I think there's a high bar for you to decide, well, I've chosen the right philosophy. It takes a lot of work to decide if you've chosen the right philosophy, and that work includes comparing and contrasting with other philosophies to see how well they answer all of the big questions. And I mean, I also think you get invaluable experience learning how to better read and write when you take courses.
Right. Here's my counter case. So there's no question that these skills are important, but I have two questions for you. Number one, to get these skills, is it better to get them at a university, which will take 4 years, which will have this significant cost? Or is there a faster and perhaps more efficient way to get this knowledge outside from the university and outside of all this? Second thing, try to think, you as Ben, all the knowledge that you have in your head, what is the percentage of that knowledge which you got from the university? I was thinking about it, and for me, the vast majority is books or podcasts, programs, whatever, that I did outside of the university. Now, did the university teach me really to write and to read? Properly, maybe did towards the level of the PhD, but still most of the stuff happened through my own work. For example, in terms of my writing skills, I got my writing skills from being part of the OAC, the Objectives Academic Center, now the Ayn Rand University. And this is not a promotion of the Ayn Rand University, that's the truth. If you see my books, I wish I wrote that book in the post-OAC years, because the university didn't really teach me how to read. So the university, the humanities can give you some knowledge, but the question is, can you find that knowledge elsewhere? Can you find it on the internet? Can you find it on alternative institutions? Not only the Ayn Rand University. Let's say, for example, you want to learn Austrian economics. There are out there, let's say, free market think tanks that can teach you in a way that I think it's better than what the university can teach you. Of course, they cannot teach you econometrics, but they can teach you theory. You want to learn the history, let's say, of communism. Or let me put it this way, you want to learn Marxism. If you go to the university and you study political theory, are you going to read Marx systematically? My answer is no. Throughout my university years, the only time I dealt with a theorist systematically is when I took an extra class with one particularly talented professor at the University of Kent, Philip Cunliffe, with whom we did a whole session on Das Kapital. So I learned Marx better by by following the workshop, which is online, of David Harvey. Now, I don't like Harvey, but his companion is good. So I learned more in terms of Marxism by following the online companion of David Harvey, rather than by whatever I was taught at the university, which was mostly platitudes. Marx talked about exploitation. Okay, big deal. I could find this in Wikipedia. So this is why I believe that, with the exception of of you getting credited that you have a degree, everything else that you present as an advantage is not necessarily an advantage, particularly if people have the illusion that in the university they're going to do more systematic work. I was asking my girlfriend earlier, out of curiosity, how many books have you read from university from start to finish? She has studied literature, and she was an excellent student, undergraduate and postgraduate. And the answer was 0. Or I was asking, have you studied or have you examined the classics? Like, have you done Shakespeare? Oh, we've done Macbeth at some point, and that was it. So the systematic element is not there as far as I know. So if you want to systematically study, let's say, an author, a philosopher, I'm not sure university is the right way. Am I wrong?
I should say first that your video, Nikos, has been cutting out a lot. We've heard everything you've said for a little while there. The video was frozen. So I can still hear what you're saying. So you might want to keep it as is, but just I want to let you know, and you can decide what to do.
While you reply to this, I'll join from a different connection. I'm right back in a second. So
you asked about how much of my knowledge I got from being in a university, and I don't know, maybe I went to better schools than you did. I typically think of them as that great of schools, but I think I did learn a lot. I think I did do a lot of reading, a lot of books cover to cover, and not just in philosophy, but in other fields in the humanities. So like I took some really great literature classes in college where we read just dozens of English novels. And when I think about the work that I did in philosophy, I as an undergraduate, I read extensively in the history of philosophy. Read all through Kant and Locke and Hume, and so I feel like I did learn a lot about the history of philosophy and the history of literature, history of art when I took my humanities courses. Now, it's a very fair question. Could I have gotten it elsewhere? Could I have done it on my own without having to, go into debt like I did to do it? Yeah, I think I could have if I had really, really tried. And I think there are more and more ways to do that now than there were when I was in school. So that's definitely worth considering. And especially since now there's the Ayn Rand University, and we offer opportunities for all kinds of study of philosophy, not just of objectivism. We often compare Ayn Rand's views to other philosophers, and students get to read from other philosophers as well, though rarely extensively. Mostly it's reading Rand extensively. So, I mean, one difference, I think, with between just kind of conventional university and something like the ARU is that you are still going to read other non-objectivist thinkers extensively. And yes, you could do that on your own, but the fact that you're taking a class, the fact that you're investing in it does give you an incentive to follow along, and it structures it for you, and you get feedback, you get grades. Now, there are some people who are real autodidacts who have the ability to motivate themselves to do all of that. And I don't usually find that I do. I find it helps to have some kind of structure and some kind of, group setting in which to learn these kinds of things. And that's part of how I got the knowledge that I got. Yeah, I mean, I think the more expensive higher education becomes, and the more opportunities there are to learn this kind of stuff on your own independently, and the internet doesn't just give you access to books and lectures. It also, there's even, study groups that you can join where you get some of that kind of group setting and scheduling and structuring. So the more technology facilitates learning, and the more expensive that education becomes, the harder it's going to get to justify going to a traditional higher education setting. I think that's true. I don't think it's going to be impossible, but it's going to be harder to justify, and you're going to have more at stake in doing so.
So here's one example, then not one point where I would say, okay, a traditional university offers more than you being autodidact. One is it gives you, let's say, a reading list. So it gives you, I found reading lists quite useful because I was collecting them while I was studying. So now I have a huge file with reading lists. But also it gives you access to a library. But the question again is not, are these things good? These things are good. The question is, are these things worth 62K per year times 4 years? To put it into perspective, and again, this is not a promotion of ARU, we've done plenty of promotion. My course, The Road to Critical Race Theory, costs $1,000 the whole course, 16 weeks. And in this, we at least 4 books. The student is expected to read the vast majority of books. We do with Marcuse, we do with the people who wrote The Road to Critical Race Theory. So there is this systematic element. And also the other thing that I think is missing in academia is the hierarchical structure. So in ARU, when we come up with a course, we put a lot of effort. What goes first? What goes second? I remember when I was teaching sociology at the university, the average reading list, the topics were completely like week 1, progress, week 2, globalization, week 3, races, week 4, gender. Like, why week 2 is gender and week 5 is alienation and not the other way around? So there is no basis based on, there is no, this, it doesn't work like a structure. It's like a building here, a building there. I think this is also how Peikoff talked about the integration of knowledge. So at least my experience in the university was that it was mostly non-integrated. And then it comes to the talented student, it comes to the interested student to pick something up that they enjoy and then go and do their own research. But again, the question is, couldn't they do this without going through the university? And notice people, up to this point, we haven't even brought to the table the issue of the ideological conformity that the university today is expected to have. So again, you will come across some very gifted or good people, even when they're leftists, and you will enjoy teaching, you will enjoy learning with them. But let's not kid ourselves, the whole ecosystem of the university has a very particular ideological orientation. So this is another question, Ben. Is the ideological conformity so off-putting that someone in our, let's say, the objectivist universe would be put off and would say, okay, it turns out humanities are not worth it? And again, I'll give you the example from a discussion I had with someone who studied literature, that mostly the discussion is not about the piece of literature itself, is about the social environment, is about what it tells us about, let's say, how the Europeans saw the natives on that period. Let's say you do Conrad, the Heart of Darkness, and it's not so much about, I want to fall in love with a piece of work. I want to, so the flame that you have, the flame about literature that you have going to study it, then this flame gets extinguished because more and more and more, it's about technicalities that hasn't got really to do with the piece of art. It has to do with other things that mostly fit the political agenda. And the same happens in other fields. So what would be your answer to that? That the logical conformity is too much to bear.
Let me back up just a bit before we get to the question about ideology, because I still want to address one thing you said about the issue, the question of whether it's worth it, especially worth it given the price. And I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that I don't think there is a blanket answer to that question. It's going to be worth it to certain individuals and not worth it to others based on what they're able to afford, based on what they think they can get from it, based on the time that they can afford to getting the most out of it that they can. And so, yeah, I mean, I think especially as more options become available, I think higher education has done a really bad job of making itself worth it to more people. And so fewer and fewer people are going to find it worthwhile, but I think some will. And you have to think carefully about which of those people you are. Especially because I think that, like, if you know enough about, and if you know how to get the right kind of advice about how to get the most out of higher education, both by finding ways to get it for cheaper and by finding ways to get it better, like, there are ways to hack the system, in effect. Like, there are schools that are better than others. There are schools that do focus on appreciating literature for its own sake and reading whole books and not just doing the kind of, ideological analysis that you were talking about. There are, great books schools in the United States, for instance, like St. John's College and others like them. That's not an endorsement of them, but, like, I know people who've been to them and who've gotten this out of them. And they do. Or
let's say with philosophy, if I'm going to study philosophy with Greg Salmieri and Tara Smith, okay, more power to you. You picked well, but this is the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, but there's even I'm not even just saying, go find the objectivists, because there aren't that many of us. I think there are better schools. And even within a school, I still think that you can do better or worse based on the classes that you yourself pick and based on the professors that you yourself pick. And it's true that it's very rare for any kind of university curriculum to include the kind of hierarchical structuring that you mentioned. But if you know enough, you can structure it yourself. You can pick and choose classes that you think will fill in gaps in your knowledge in that kind of hierarchical way. And sometimes it involves going, taking them from lots of different departments. I myself did something like this when I was both an undergraduate and a graduate student. I think I did a pretty good job giving myself a good overall education in the history of philosophy because of it. I wasn't required to by the terms of any of the degrees that I was taking. And people sometimes wondered, why is this guy taking this class? But it was because I was trying to give myself that kind of hierarchical structured education. So you can do it if you try. Now, it's probably harder to do it now than it was when I was in school, because I think in lots of ways the universities have gotten worse. But there are still older schools where something like that is possible. So then when it comes to ideology, yes, I mean, it's definitely true that there are so many different ways in which your reading of even valuable texts is slanted and filtered through the lens of so many different irrational theories that are presupposed by the pedagogy that today's professors use. No question about it. I do think it's still possible to filter that out yourself and to make the most of your own reading of it, regardless of what the professor says. I also think that even though you hear lots of stories in the media about people being irrationally punished for their views in academia, I think it's the worst stories that tend to get amplified. And I think that on average, generally speaking, in universities today, it's not as bad as the amplified stories would suggest. And here I speak in part from my own experience, not just as a student, but as a professor. I mean, for one thing, I was teaching university courses up until just 5 years ago. I was not teaching through these kind of filters, and I think that there are others like me. I mean, I like to tell the story about how when I was at Loyola University New Orleans, I was pretty open about my ideological leanings when people asked me, certainly when students asked me, even when professors asked me, even when my bosses asked me, I told them what I thought. And it certainly raised some eyebrows, and they thought I was weird, but I never was punished for it in obvious ways. I mean, maybe the school that I was teaching at was exceptional. In certain ways, it probably was. It was a Catholic school, and I think Catholic schools tend to be more, tend to emphasize more on the history of philosophy. And because they're Catholic, they feel like they're somewhat outside of the cultural mainstream, and I think they have a little bit more tolerance for other people who are outside of the cultural mainstream, even if they're not Catholic. And this is no endorsement of Catholicism, because I'm ex-Catholic myself. But like, I taught a whole class on Atlas Shrugged. 2 sections they gave me at Loyola University, New Orleans. And so I got to teach objectivism for a whole course, for a whole semester. And they didn't, and I remained employed like several years after I did that. And
same here, 2 years I was openly employed by, like, it was on my Twitter bio, it was all my colleagues do it, and I was actually employed by ARI, and I was still teaching at the university, and I had no problem. So
I'll add one thing to that, which is that even after I left, and I left of my own volition, I could have stayed if I wanted to. They would have kept hiring me. Even after I left and I went to work at the Ayn Rand Institute, and I told them I was going to work at the Ayn Rand Institute, they called me back a year later and said, we need to fill some courses. Do you want to help? Do you want to teach us, teach a course for us? And I said, sure. And so I did one more class even after I was working at ARI, and they didn't mind. Now, yeah, it might be an exceptional school, but like, the point is, this still happens, and you're not automatically condemned to academic hell for being an objectivist.
Yeah. But the question we're posing is not, are you going to be cancelled? The question we're posing is it worth it? So to sum up, then, as we're reaching towards an end, because I want also to address a question by the audience, my position is it is worth it only if you have someone particular with whom you want to study. So I mentioned Greg, but as you said, it would be non-objective. So many people would come to University of Kent to study with Frank Furedi, for example, who was also my second PhD supervisor. So, or let's say you want to do Marx, and there is this very particular scholar of Marx, we want to study with them. That's one reason. But this means that you have a very clear plan in front of you, and university is part of this plan. For me, this is the only reason you should study. Or in order to make the best of the experience, you already need to be disciplined and be able to judge good from bad, to create a structure out of a structureless curriculum, for example. And this is the only way. However, I would say that most of these things, you can find them also outside of the university. Whereas you, Ben, you are saying that, again, it depends from person to person, and that although university overall might not be as fit to purpose as we think, a good student, someone who knows why they want to study something, they will get value out of it. So, yeah.
Add one thing to that. So I definitely agree that the best reason to go is if you have a very definite kind of knowledge you think you can get, where there's some expert in that field where you think you can get it from them. But I can add one more very general category of a very good reason to go to a university. And that's if you don't know what you want to do, and you don't have knowledge of what specific field you want to study or what expert you want to study in. And there are still, I think, universities where one of the major values they offer is the student who doesn't yet know what they want to do with themselves to figure it out because it allows you to survey and sample and compare and contrast all the different fields, all the different viewpoints. And I definitely know people who've expanded their horizons and figured out what they want to do with their life by going to college. Now, there are other people who go and get lost and never figure it out, but it's the kind of thing that's possible at a university if you know that that's your problem and then you're looking for a solution to it. And I'll add one more thing, which I think fits into that same genre. And this is, again, not for everybody, but one thing I think in particular that underappreciated about the value of a university education, especially when it's a residential university, it's not just classes that you're taking online, is that when you're a young person, you're just leaving your parents, and there's a way in which a university, a residential university, is a really good kind of transitional place for you to leave your parents and to go out into the wider world, because you're leaving home. You still go back maybe during the summer to your parents, but you're leaving home, you're living on your own, and you're not quite all the way out into the world because you're not working full time. You're not necessarily living in your own place. Maybe you're living in a dorm, although sometimes people live in apartments when they're in college. And it's university is kind of like a little mini society of its own, with its own its own internal politics, its own kind of governance structure, its own little economy. And there's a way of entering the adult world, especially training yourself as a kind of citizen, that I think you get from a university of education, where it's not just what you're receiving from your professors, but it's the way you get to interact with other people, the way you get to training in certain kinds of leadership skills, if you're running clubs or if you're engaged in campus politics. I definitely, I think, got invaluable social and leadership skills from having to debate with people I disagreed with, having to negotiate living situations with people. And that's something that you get, I think, from going to a residential university. I mean, I was infamous on my campus in certain ways as an undergraduate. And, I did all kinds of awkward things myself, and it figured out eventually that that was not the right way to do it. There's a better way to do it. So there's something to be said there. Now, again, this all comes at a cost, and it has to be worth it to you financially. And as universities become more and more expensive, it's harder and harder to justify, I couldn't get this kind of leadership training somewhere else outside of university. Well, you probably could, but it's at least one way to get it. And I should mention, there's also cheaper ways to get. I mean, students are figuring out ways to hack the system to get cheaper degrees. I mean, one that I'm a fan of, I'm impressed by the students who've done it, is they start out by getting a 2-year community college associate's degree, which is really inexpensive, and then they transfer to a bachelor's program, and they usually only have to take 2 years of undergraduate education to get their bachelor's degree, because they transfer the credits, and it ends up you end up having to spend a lot less for the same degree.
Right. So let's see what our audience says. So many thanks to Jonathan Honing for your contribution. Many thanks to Christopher. Nadav, thanks for your suggestion about Clubhouse. Unfortunately, I can't do it. And if you want, you can type the short version of what you tell us in the comments. So Equal to Reality has a question, and thank you very much for your contribution. Is the best way to learn objectivism only through the AOC? I assume you mean the OAC, the former OAC, Objectives Academic Center, now the Ayn Rand University. Even though I don't have any interest in being an intellectual, our friend says, just improving my mind. So 2 things on this. And then Ben is going to answer. He's way more experienced with these programs. He's been teaching in them way longer. So the way I have it in my mind, how some people, they learn martial arts by watching a video, and you might do the moves, let's say, on the floor with a pillow or with something like that. When you enter, though, an actual dojo, it's a completely different experience. That was my experience when I entered as a student the Objective Academic Center. I thought I knew objectivism. I entered, it's what they call, I know objectivists don't like the term, a humbling experience. You realize that there's so much that you don't know and so much that is to learn. So obviously you can learn alone, but unless you are a super exceptional, such a structure is going to help you, because here's the thing with the ARU. You learn with people who in that area are in the 99th, or I don't know if there's a 100 percentile, like Onkar, Ben when it comes to philosophy, Keith when it comes to writing. You get public speaking lessons from Yaron Brook. Like, could we all agree that Yaron is somewhere on the top 95th to 99th percentile of public speakers? And you have someone like that teaching you public speaking. And this also comes to the other point you make, that our friend makes, which is, I don't want to become an intellectual. Okay, but whatever you do in life, you do need communication skills. You do need critical thinking skills. And critical thinking in Ayn Rand University is true critical thinking. It's not, oh, we're going to teach you critical thinking, which is basically parrot the views that we have. I remember my first class ever with Onkar Gate, again, when I was a student in the Ayn Rand University. He told us that I never want you to take something on faith or to say Ayn Rand says this, therefore this sorts it out. And the other thing is that as a teacher, I was evaluated on the type of questions I asked. So I remember Ben was marking my assignments when I was a student. And the first time he gave me a 5 out of 5, was at some point in late February. So it took me 6 months to persuade him that I know how to ask questions. So this is the type of educational and intellectual environment that the ARU is. But Ben, what do you think about this? Do you need to study at ARU to really understand objectivism? And what about someone who says, I don't want to be an intellectual?
Several things. One is, here's a better way to maybe describe what the experience you had. I would say an eye-opening experience rather than a humbling experience. I had the same eye-opening experience at several points in my involvement with educational programs run by the Ayn Rand Institute. The first of them was way back in the late 1990s, when the predecessor of the ARU, the predecessor of the OAC, what we used to call the Objectivist Graduate Center, was happening. I took classes with Harry Binswanger for many years, from like 1998 to 2006 or 7 or something like that. And it was an invaluable experience to be able to just study objectivism in parallel with the classes that I was taking at university at the time. And to be able to study with someone like Dr. Binswanger, who to me was like a famous superstar, and I couldn't believe I got to sit in on classes with him and get his feedback, and in ways that just gave me all kinds of ideas for the work that I was doing in university as well. So that was the first eye-opening experience. The second eye-opening experience was many years later. I had finished my PhD. I'd been teaching in universities for many years. And when I came to work at the Ayn Rand Institute, I'd been involved in objectivism for like 20 plus years at this point, and was a professional philosophy teacher even. And so, I knew a lot about objectivism already. That's true at that point. But even still, so I, at this point, started to get involved with the teaching classes at the then Objectivist Academic Center with Onkar Gate. And at the time, I wasn't so much teaching as I was assisting with the classes that Onkar was teaching. And even the introductory level classes that he was teaching, I was still blown away by the perspective that he brought to this material, the way he put things together, made connections that I had never made, wouldn't have been able to make on my own. And so I learned a huge amount about objectivism. Like the first year I was helping to teach at at OAC classes because of Ankar. And this is, after 20 plus years of studying it with all kinds of philosophical background. And this still happens. I mean, I still, even as I'm teaching many courses at ARU myself, I still sit in on as many of Ankar's classes, even his introductory classes, as I can, just because I always pick something up and get some perspective that I didn't get before. And your analogy to the dojo, I think, was apt as well, because part of what you, and I'm not quite sure if this is what you're getting at, but part of what you get from actually going into a dojo, I assume, I've never done martial arts, as opposed to simply watching them on YouTube, is you get hands-on interactive feedback and training. And that's something that if you're really, 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 really smart, you can maybe replicate for yourself as an autodidact, but I'm not that smart. And
I
so
couldn't either. I was not. And now people wonder, wait, Ben in the 90s was studying with Harry Rizvi. Well, Ben hasn't got a single gray hair, but he has been around for he has been around for some. I had the same thing, like you and Keith. You look like eternally like in your 30s. So
it's all genetics, nothing to do with the philosophy I study.
Okay, so that's all, people, for today. Again, the conclusion is yours on whether university is for you. The good news is that these days there are more and more options available to you. So if you want to hear more about the Ayn Rand University, you can just Google Ayn Rand University. And then one of the first options you will see is Ayn Rand University courses. And then you can go and see what are the available courses and who is teaching them.
And we're right between quarters right now. We're right between quarter 3 and quarter 4. We go year round and take weeks off in between the quarters. And so there's a bunch of new courses starting in just a few weeks, I think after the Ayn Rand Con in Athens. So
next week,
especially if people in your audience are going to that conference, which I know you are, Nikos, you should try to find Nikos and find Ankar and a few and other institute staff who are going to be at that conference, and talk to them and see what they have to offer and see how they answer your questions, and see how, could you have answered this question on your own? That'll be a good indication of a good sample of what you can expect to get on just a regular basis if you take classes from ARU.
Definitely. So many thanks to Ben, many thanks to our viewers, many thanks to the Ayn Rand Center for hosting us, and see you all soon. Bye-bye.